The super empath who lives in the avoidance head 24/7 is not a story about someone being loved and forgotten. It's about someone being loved, resisted, pushed away, and still somehow becoming impossible to erase from memory. It starts in a way most people would never notice at first, almost like background noise in an ordinary life. An avoidant moves through distance like it is comfort, like silence is safety, like emotional space is freedom. They convince themselves that detachment is control, that not needing anyone is strength, that keeping things light is how they protect themselves from overwhelm. And then this one person enters their life, not loudly, not forcefully, not demanding attention, but with a presence so steady, so emotionally intelligent, and so quietly grounding that it doesn't feel like intrusion, it feels like understanding. And that is where everything begins to shift, even though nothing dramatic seems to be happening on the surface yet. This is the kind of connection that does not immediately look dangerous, but later becomes unforgettable. And if you've ever found yourself wondering why someone who moved on still seems mentally stuck on a specific person, make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to understand explains patterns most people never connect until it's too late. To understand why this super empath becomes so psychologically permanent in an avoidance mind, you first have to understand what makes them different from every other emotional presence the avoidant has ever encountered. A super empath is not just someone who feels deeply. They understand deeply, but they do not lose themselves in what they feel. They can read emotional shifts without absorbing emotional chaos. They can sit in silence without panicking. They can sense distance without immediately trying to close it. Most importantly, they can offer genuine emotional presence without turning it into emotional dependency. Where many people either chase or withdraw, the super empath remains anchored. They do not perform emotional stability. They embody it, and this is exactly what makes them so psychologically powerful in the eyes of an avoidant, because avoidants are not actually afraid of love itself. They are afraid of emotional overwhelm, pressure, expectations, and loss of control. So when they encounter someone who feels emotionally safe without being emotionally needy, something unfamiliar happens. Their nervous system relaxes in a way it rarely does. There is no pressure to perform, no demand to open up faster than they can handle, no emotional suffocation. It feels like connection without collapse, and that feeling, once experienced, does not disappear easily from memory. But here is where the avoidant makes a subtle mistake that changes everything. At first, they assume this emotional safety is just the natural state of the connection. They assume the super empath's patience is normal. They assume their understanding is unconditional in a way that will always remain available, no matter how inconsistent they become. They mistake emotional intelligence for emotional immunity. They assume that because this person does not chase, they will never leave. Because they do not pressure, they will always wait. Because they do not react dramatically, they will always stay stable regardless of how they are treated. This is where the dynamic quietly starts to tilt. The avoidant begins leaning into distance, testing boundaries without fully realizing they are doing it. They pull back a little more than necessary. They delay responses. They create space and observe what happens. And in the beginning, the super empath understands. They read the situation through compassion, not judgment. They give room, not punishment. But internally, they are also observing. Because super empaths do not ignore patterns, they recognize them. And while they are patient, they are not blind. They start noticing when distance is not about needing space, but about avoiding responsibility. And this is the moment the emotional structure of the relationship begins to quietly change, even though neither person fully acknowledges it yet. As the push-pull dynamic unfolds, the avoidant continues retreating in small waves, expecting the same emotional response they have always received from others: pursuit, explanation, reassurance, emotional chasing. But the super empath does something different. At first, they try to understand the rhythm of the connection, not control it. They do not overreact. They do not escalate. They do not turn every silence into a crisis. Instead, they observe. They give space where it is appropriate and clarity where it is necessary. But slowly, something shifts inside them. They begin to realize that emotional consistency is not being matched, that effort is not being mirrored, that understanding is not being reciprocated with the same level of presence. And this is where the super empath becomes something the avoidant did not anticipate, emotionally self-aware enough to stop over-investing in imbalance. They start withdrawing not out of punishment, but out of clarity. Their energy becomes more selective. Their availability becomes more intentional. Their emotional labor is no longer automatic, and without any dramatic confrontation, the dynamic begins to transform. Because for the first time, the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who automatically compensates for their distance. They are interacting with someone who notices it and adjusts accordingly. This is where the psychological impact truly begins. Because when the super empath stops overgiving, something very unfamiliar happens inside the avoidance experience. Silence no longer guarantees return. Distance no longer guarantees pursuit. Emotional withdrawal no longer guarantees repair from the other side. The familiar cycle breaks, and in that break, uncertainty enters. Not loud uncertainty, but quiet, persistent uncertainty, the kind that lingers in the background of thoughts. The avoidant starts to feel it in small moments first. A message that would normally arrive faster doesn't. A conversation that would normally be reopened stays closed. An emotional presence that used to feel consistent becomes less predictable. And what makes this especially powerful is that the super empath is not acting differently out of strategy. They are simply no longer abandoning themselves to maintain connection. They are still present but not overextended, still open but not overexposed, still caring but no longer compensating. And this creates a completely new emotional reality for the avoidant, one they are not used to navigating. Because now, instead of being the one who controls distance, they are the one feeling its consequences. And without realizing it, the super empath has begun living in a space that the avoidant cannot easily ignore anymore. Not in their life, but in their mind. And once someone starts living in that space, not physically but mentally, the entire emotional architecture of the avoidant begins to shift in ways they cannot fully control. Because the mind does not treat absence lightly when that absence used to feel reliably present. The super empath becomes this quiet reference point in the avoidant's internal world, not because they are trying to be remembered, but because their consistency created a contrast that is hard to unsee once it is gone. Ordinary moments begin triggering unusual reflections. A random pause in the day brings up a memory of how calm things felt when communication was effortless. A small silence in another interaction suddenly reminds them of how this one person never needed chaos to be understood. And the strange part is, the super empath is not doing anything to provoke these thoughts. They are not sending reminders, not forcing reconnection, not creating emotional hooks. They simply exist in memory as someone who offered something rare, emotional safety without emotional demand. And the human mind, especially one that has experienced emotional unpredictability, does not forget safety easily. It replays it, it reevaluates it, it compares it. Until slowly, the avoidant begins noticing that not every connection feels the same anymore, even if they try to convince themselves otherwise. As this internal comparison grows stronger, the avoidant starts entering a stage that feels uncomfortably reflective. They begin mentally replaying conversations that once felt casual but now feel significant. Moments that were brushed aside at the time now appear differently under the lens of absence. A response that seemed simple starts revealing emotional depth they did not fully appreciate in the moment. A moment of patience they assumed was normal now feels rare. And with every reflection, the super empath becomes more defined in their memory, not as someone dramatic, but as someone steady, someone consistent, someone who did not fluctuate emotionally in response to every inconsistency. This is where nostalgia begins to quietly creep in, not as an emotional explosion but as a soft reorganization of memory. The avoidant does not always realize they are idealizing. They believe they are simply remembering, but what they are actually doing is reconstructing emotional value from distance. And distance has a way of amplifying clarity in a way presence often does not, because when someone is always there, the mind does not feel the urgency to understand them deeply. But when they are no longer immediately accessible, every detail becomes heavier, every memory gains weight, and every interaction starts to feel like it mattered more than it was originally given credit for. Meanwhile, the super empath is no longer participating in the emotional imbalance that once defined the connection. Their shift is not loud or performative. It is not about proving a point or teaching a lesson. It is simply the natural result of self-respect meeting emotional intelligence. They begin investing their energy elsewhere, into their own growth, their own peace, their own clarity, and this is where their influence becomes even more powerful, ironically through absence rather than presence. Because when someone who once filled emotional space with understanding steps back, that space does not remain empty in the mind of the other person. It becomes active, it becomes noticeable, it becomes something the avoidant starts feeling without fully understanding why. There is a difference between losing someone through conflict and losing someone through clarity. Conflict creates noise, clarity creates silence, and silence is often far more psychologically persistent. The avoidant may not express this outwardly, but internally something begins shifting. They start noticing how often their thoughts drift back to this person, how certain emotions feel incomplete without them, how interactions with others do not quite recreate the same sense of being emotionally seen without pressure. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the realization forms that this was not just another connection that faded, it was something that altered their internal emotional baseline. This is also where another uncomfortable layer emerges for the avoidant, the recognition of emotional contrast. They begin comparing past and present experiences without intending to. New interactions feel slightly different even if they are good on the surface. Conversations may still happen, attention may still be present, but something feels less grounded, less understood, less emotionally intuitive, and without consciously choosing to, the avoidant starts measuring these experiences against the memory of the superempath. Not because they want to go back, but because the mind naturally uses emotional reference points to evaluate current reality, and once that reference point is someone who offered depth without pressure, it becomes very difficult to ignore the difference. The avoidant may resist this realization at first, convincing themselves that it is just nostalgia or overthinking, but the feeling persists in subtle ways, a sense of emotional absence where presence used to be, a quiet awareness that something meaningful was part of their life, even if they did not fully recognize it at the time. And this is where emotional distance begins transforming into emotional awareness. The very space they created to feel free starts becoming the space where reflection becomes unavoidable. Eventually, this leads the avoidant into a deeper confrontation with their own emotional patterns. The superempath did not just leave a memory, they left a mirror that reflects not only what was given, but how it was received. And in that reflection, the avoidant begins seeing patterns they may have previously justified or overlooked. The tendency to withdraw when things become emotionally real, the instinct to pull back when connection feels too stable, the habit of assuming emotional availability will always remain even without consistent effort. And now, in the absence of someone who once balanced their emotional distance with understanding, those patterns become more visible, not in a judgmental way, but in a revealing one. The avoidant starts recognizing that not every connection will tolerate emotional inconsistency indefinitely. Not every person will remain in a cycle of distance and return, and not every empath will continue sacrificing themselves in hopes of being chosen more fully. This awareness does not always lead to immediate change, but it plants something important, a question about what they actually want versus what they have been repeating, a question about whether they are protecting themselves from intimacy or simply postponing it. And that question, once it enters, does not leave easily. It follows them into quiet moments, into reflection, into every memory that still carries emotional weight. Because the superempath did not just occupy their attention while present, they continue to occupy their thoughts long after distance begins. And that is where the real psychological impact quietly lives. And once that psychological echo settles in, something even more revealing begins to happen inside the avoidant's emotional world. They don't just think about the superempath occasionally anymore, they start returning to them in moments that have nothing to do with the past connection itself. A random pause in a conversation with someone new brings them back. A familiar silence in an unrelated interaction triggers comparison. Even moments of emotional ease feel slightly incomplete, as if something subtle is missing but impossible to name directly. This is how the superempath begins to live 24/7 in their head, not as an obsession created by drama, but as a standard created by contrast. The mind is not always loyal to what is convenient. It is loyal to what felt significant. And when someone once represented emotional clarity without pressure, presence without control, and understanding without emotional chaos, that imprint does not fade simply because the relationship ended. It becomes a reference point the avoidant cannot fully unsee. And the more time passes, the more the memory shifts from being about the person to being about how they felt around that person. Safe, seen, understood without needing to over-explain. That feeling becomes the real haunting element because it doesn't depend on contact to exist, it survives entirely in recollection. As this internal repetition deepens, the avoidant begins doing something almost involuntary, reconstructing the relationship from a distance. Not the version they live day to day, but the version that appears when emotional distance softens resistance. They start remembering patience they once dismissed as normal. They start recognizing consistency they once assumed was guaranteed. They start reinterpreting moments where the superempath didn't react emotionally as indifference, but as emotional maturity. And this reinterpretation creates a subtle but powerful emotional shift. The avoidant is no longer simply remembering events, they are reassessing value, and reassessment always brings discomfort, because it implies something was misunderstood in real time. This is where emotional regret begins to form, not always as longing, but as awareness that they were interacting with someone who offered more stability than they were prepared to match, awareness that distance was not always met with pursuit, awareness that emotional availability was not infinite, even if it once felt that way, and perhaps the most confronting realization of all, that the connection did not collapse because it lacked depth, but because depth was not fully met on both sides. That realization doesn't arrive loudly. It builds slowly, in fragments, through memory and contrast, until it becomes impossible to completely ignore. Meanwhile, the superempath continues moving through life in a way that amplifies this psychological distance even further. Because what makes them so impactful is not just what they gave during the connection, but what they refuse to give afterward: emotional instability in response to inconsistency. They are not chasing closure. They are not seeking validation from the past. They are not rewriting their worth based on someone else's inability to stay present. Instead, they continue evolving. They continue investing in themselves. They continue strengthening the parts of their identity that existed before the emotional attachment formed. And this creates something that is far more powerful in hindsight than it ever appeared in real time: emotional permanence through absence. The avoidant realizes, even if subconsciously, that this person is not anchored to them anymore. Not emotionally, not mentally, not in a dependent way. And that absence of attachment creates a different kind of presence in memory. It makes them harder to replace emotionally because they were never built on dependency in the first place. The super-empath did not leave behind emotional chaos that demands resolution. They left behind emotional clarity that invites reflection. And reflection, unlike chaos, does not fade quickly. It lingers. This is also where comparison becomes unavoidable for the avoidant, even if they resist it. New interactions begin to feel subtly different, not because they are necessarily worse, but because they lack the emotional texture that once existed with the super-empath. Conversations may still flow, attention may still be given, but something about emotional depth feels less intuitive, less grounding, less naturally understood. And without consciously intending to, the avoidant starts measuring emotional experiences against that internal reference point they can no longer fully access. It becomes less about the person they lost and more about the emotional state they lost access to. And this distinction is important because it explains why the super-empath does not simply fade into memory like most past connections. They become a benchmark, a psychological comparison point the mind returns to whenever emotional depth is questioned. Even if the avoidant moves forward externally, internally they are still referencing a version of emotional safety they experienced once but cannot easily replicate again. And that gap between experience and replacement is where psychological persistence begins. Eventually, this leads the avoidant into a quieter but more significant realization: the super-empath was not trying to be unforgettable. They simply were. Not through intensity, not through drama, not through emotional manipulation, but through consistency combined with self-respect. And that combination is what creates long-term psychological presence, because the human mind may forget excitement, it may even forget conflict, but it rarely forgets emotional safety that felt authentic, especially when that safety was not conditional on performance, chasing, or constant reassurance. The avoidant begins recognizing that the relationship did not feel the same for both people over time, and that realization introduces a level of emotional accountability they may not have faced before, not as blame but as clarity. Clarity that emotional distance has consequences. Clarity that availability is not infinite. Clarity that some connections do not remain accessible simply because they once were. And that clarity is what slowly shifts the super-empath from being a memory into being a mental presence that resurfaces at unexpected times. Not because they are actively thinking of them, but because their emotional imprint was built